the classic by Miguel de Cervantes, Don Quixote. But if you'll remember, kind of in the early part of that great work, Don Quixote and his faithful sidekick Sancho Panza are riding through the plains, and Don Quixote is just enamored with a woman by the name of Dulcinea. She's beautiful, and he is captivated, and he is being as chivalrous as possible in order to try to gain the love of Dulcinea. And one day when they're riding through the plains, he looks out and he sees these giants, and he decides he's going to joust against these giants. And his sidekick Sancho Panza tries to talk him out of it because they're not really giants, they're actually windmills. But he is so delusional, and he is so caught up in the delusion of his affinity for Dulcinea that he can't see reality for what it is, and he jousts with a windmill, and he's knocked off his horse, and Sancho Panza's like, you know, I tried to tell you, but he just can't see it. And that's what it feels like in the world today, that we're caught up in a delusion, that we just can't see the real things that matter to a large extent. And you know, we're just being sold a myriad of lies. We're being sold the lie that biology doesn't matter. We're being sold the lie that really the family unit is kind of a decaying and archaic way of doing things. And of course, you know, children being born out of wedlock is something that produces a problem for me on my end, what we're doing at Foster's Home. Just so many different things, and the decay of the family is just another thing that is producing this great number of kids that are entering the system. And I'll say this as well. I'm glad that Roe v. Wade was overturned, but I hope you understand. That that with Roe v. Wade being overturned, we're going to find a huge influx in the not too distant future of more kids in the system. It's true. It's just the demographic that is prone to aborting children is also a demographic that tends to produce kids that live at children's homes. It's an unintended consequence. So we really can't afford to fiddle while Rome burns. We just can't. And of course, this is one of the reasons why I'm speaking to churches in ways that I am about trying to provide services, yes, that serve a need, but I'm glad to say that at Foster's Home, we're kind of trying to branch out a little bit and trying to provide some services that are front-end services in an attempt to help keep kids out of the system. And of course, this is where churches have an opportunity to step up and really start meeting the needs of families to try to keep kids out of the system, whether it's counseling services, whether it's, you know, just housing and all sorts of things like that. There are ways and things that we can do to help mitigate against this growing number of kids that are entering foster care. And we've established a single mom program that's in the very grassroots ground level of implementation, but it's going to help us hopefully keep some kids out of foster care and really do some things that are needed. And so I'm excited about that. Our aftercare program for 18 to 23-year-olds continues to grow and flourish, and we're excited about that as well. And of course, just our everyday child care work for kids that are right out of the hospital being born all the way to 18 continues to be solid, and we're excited about that, and we're excited that this church plays a part in it. And you do. You're a partner that help us do what a lot of people would like to be able to be involved in and get their hands dirty in, but it just isn't in their cards, and that's okay. That's why places like Foster's Home exist. And I'm grateful for the Johnsville Church and its ability to help us do that because it's important. I said that we're being sold some lies in the world today, and the third lie that I spoke to at Camp Bambina last year is one I wanted to spend just a brief amount of time with you this morning considering. And I would have never thought much about it, but remember that I have both a history in children's homes and in church work. And so I preached for 15 years, and I've seen a lot in the time that I started my first work back in 1999 till now. And today our kids, and to a certain extent the church, is being sold a lie that says that in order to love someone, you have to affirm them. And we're taught about, we hear a lot said about tolerance and what it means to be tolerant, and that now that you can't love a person and then not accept them in whatever their lifestyle might be. And I want you to know that it's just not true. I get the need to love, and I get the need to recognize that maybe in times past we've approached people in their sin in ways that was anything but loving. But Jesus is the one that we have to look to. And ironically enough, people that are preaching this, affirming people in their sin, are actually using Jesus to do it. And yet I want to spend just a brief amount of time with you this morning in two stories, both from the book of John, that teach us that to love someone, you need not have to affirm the lifestyle that they may be living. Now, the first one comes from John chapter 8, and I bring it up because it is where Jesus winds up making a very definitive statement that proves that loving someone who might be living a life of sin doesn't mean that they have to affirm them in that sin. And it's Jesus when the scribes and Pharisees bring a woman to him who was caught literally in the act of adultery. Okay? It's in the very early part of John chapter 8. It says in verse 2, early in the morning he came again to the temple, and all the people came with him. And he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, placing her in the midst. And they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women." And that, of course, is true. So what do you say? So the scribes and Pharisees know that Jesus has been preaching a message. He's been working with people in a unique way. And of course, John lets us know in verse 6 that they said this to test him. What is he going to do? Is he going to be this gracious person who says, "Oh, it's okay, it's no big deal"? Or is he going to conform to the law of Moses and stone the woman? Because after all, adulterers were to be stoned. It says they said this to test him, and that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and he wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and then said, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. And when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. I'm going to stop here, okay? Because it's very easy to see into this what isn't actually here. A lot of people maybe who want to eliminate the idea of Jesus taking a hard line on a person in living a life of sin would say, well, nobody's perfect. Let him who's without sin cast the first stone. As if Jesus was saying, look, none of you are perfect. You've all committed sin, so give the woman a break. That tends to be the view that people take of this. And I get where they might get that. The problem is, it comes from maybe a lack of understanding of the law of Moses. If you read Deuteronomy chapter 17, you'll find out, yes, that there were these certain instances where people were to be stoned for certain sins, of which adultery was one. Now, isn't it interesting, to say the least, that this woman is brought to Moses, or excuse me, to Jesus, and there's no man with her? She didn't commit adultery by herself, right? I know Jesus said that in Matthew 5 that if you look at someone, with the intent to sin, that you committed adultery in your heart, and I get what he's saying there, but this is a woman being caught in the act. But where's the man? He is conspicuously absent. And of course, if you read Deuteronomy chapter 17, you'll find out that the person who was to throw the first stone is actually the witness to it, who of course wasn't culpable, who wasn't a part of it. And of course, this was a safeguard. This was to keep someone from conjuring up an accusation against someone in order to get an upper hand. Maybe a husband, if a husband was to conjure up a notion that his wife was committing adultery, he would have to provide evidence and then not be culpable to it, and that was a safeguard so that you wouldn't just conjure up an accusation against somebody so that you could be free from them. They had to be the first one to throw a stone. But nobody's there to do it. That's why they all leave. They know the law. Jesus knew the law. They either conjured up the accusation, or maybe the one who was caught in the act with her was actually there. Who knows? But they leave because they don't have a basis to stone her. And I know this has to be true because when Jesus says to the woman, "Where are your accusers? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." Jesus did not ignore the woman's sin. He actually tells her, you go and sin no more. There was no basis by the law of Moses to stone her because there wasn't a witness to it. And so Jesus says they can't stone you. But that doesn't mean you're to go on living your lifestyle. He tells her, go and sin no more. He didn't ignore her sin. He dealt with it in the most constructive of ways. So Jesus didn't buy into this notion of, oh well, no one's perfect. He didn't affirm her in her adultery. He says, go and sin no more. Now the second story comes from John, and it's John chapter 4. And it's an even more intriguing story. And here we find out that there are ways of going about communicating things. We don't have to point it out to people. Some people may very well be wrestling with their own sinfulness and their own inadequacies. And sometimes you don't have to say things to them to get a point across. And here, of course, it's the equivalent of Jesus in a situation with someone who was a distant kin, this woman from Samaria. They're at Jacob's well. She's there at an odd time to get water. Jesus is there coincidentally. And Jesus asked this Samaritan, a distant kin. And of course, the angst in the first century between Jews and Samaritans is incredibly noteworthy. In the world that I live in, living in Stephenville, it would be the equivalent of the angst between people from Stephenville and Brownwood. I mean, didn't like each other. Okay? They were distant kin. The Samaritans were the diluted Jewish people after the kind of the demise of the United Kingdom after Solomon dies. And so there was a recognition of each other and the distant relationship that they had, but the Samaritans, we know, and the Jews were not fans of each other. And so Jesus asked this woman to draw water for him, and she's taken aback by it. And she says in verse 9 of John 4, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink from me, a woman of Samaria?" Because the Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Jesus begins to talk to her about this living water that he could give her. And she's a little confounded, and she's like, man, I'd love to have this kind of water. And Jesus says in verse 13, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks from the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. Water that I will give him will come in as a spring of water welling up to eternal life." And she's like, "Sir, give me this water so that I can not be thirsty anymore and come here to have to draw water anymore." And once again, you see the idea. She's not getting it. I mean, he's talking about something much different. She's still thinking in earthly terms. So Jesus goes, "Go get your husband. Go get your husband." She goes, "Well, I don't have a husband." And he goes, "You're right. You're right. I've had 5. And the one you're with now is not your husband. You're shacking up with someone else." What an interesting little detail about this woman that he brings to light. There are any number, and of course she goes, "Oh, sir, I perceive that you must be a prophet." There are any number of details about about this woman's life that Jesus would have been cognizant of, that he could have shared with her. Interesting that he brings out this tantalizing detail, a shameful detail. She apparently doesn't have a good penchant for finding husbands. And maybe she's like recognizing it and thinks, well, maybe the solution is just to shack up with someone. Who knows? Not all that dissimilar from today's times, quite frankly, because marriage is on shaky ground. Even amongst Christians, marriage is on shaky ground. And today we're finding it incredibly prevalent where young men and women are saying, well, let's just test the waters before we get married and we'll live together and see how that works. And of course, in certain instances, it winds up working out. They may find themselves getting married and having kids and everything being well and good. And then in other instances, it's creating issues for people like me that run children's homes. It's true. But back to the story, because Jesus could have brought up any number of different things to let this woman know that he was a prophet. But he brings this interesting little detail about her. And she gets it for what it is. And they begin to talk about how their fathers worshipped on this mountain. And Jesus says, look, you don't understand who you worship and what you worship. But salvation's from the Jews, and the hour is coming when the true worshipers will worship the Father with spirit and in spirit and in truth. And the woman says to him, I know that Messiah is coming, for he is called Christ. And when he comes, he will tell us all things. And he says to her, I am he. This one of whom you speak, I am he. And she goes and leaves and, begins to tell people that she's, found this one Christ and that they need to hear what he has to say. Interesting story. And in my opinion, Jesus brings up this detail about her life, not necessarily to shame her, but it obviously hits the spot. It hits the spot. He didn't have to shame her. He didn't have to say, you've got a terrible track record. But he utilizes this detail about her life that he knew for the purpose of letting her see what she knew. Sometimes things are better left unsaid. And I know that seems odd, but Jesus, I think, points out this detail about her life so that there is no way in the world she and those of us who've come after, who read some 2,000 years removed, would ever develop a notion that Jesus affirms people in their sin. He knew, and she knew, that she didn't have a great track record. But that didn't make her unfit for the kingdom of God. But that also meant that there was a little bit of work that needed to be done. Now, there's a whole lot I'd like to know from the rest of the story. And I sure wish Paul Harvey might have found it out before he passed away. But it is a story that lets us know some insight into how Jesus operated. And Jesus did not affirm people in their sin. Sometimes he told them, go and sin no more. At other times, he just let them know what he knew and what they knew so that they could address it in their own time. We're being sold a lie that to be loving, that we just gotta let things be, and we can affirm people in their sin and in their lifestyles, and it's just not true. The New Testament makes very little sense if that's the case. The idea of repentance is completely and totally unessential if that's the case. I get not wanting to send the wrong message. I get not wanting to rub people the wrong way. I get providing a means for communicating to people so that they're able to receive the truth of Jesus. But we cannot compromise and make Jesus into someone who he obviously wasn't. And people are trying to do it, and they're going to continue to try to do it. And I get maybe on a certain level why they want people to perceive Jesus in this way, but it's completely and totally foreign to who he really was. You can be loving and at the same time help people in their plight. And sometimes you don't have to say the things that you think you want to say to shame people into getting their life right with God. Most people, I think, already know it. So maybe we ought to be a little more like Jesus and deal with them in ways that helps them to see their own inadequacies, but doesn't, smear their faces in, the feces of their sin. They don't need that. But we still need Jesus no matter what. And we can't afford to be buying into the lies that the world may be telling us because that's the spirit of the world. And while it may sound similar to what Jesus might have said or done from time to time, I think that's why John said, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world, for all that's in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, are not of God, but are of the world. And if you look at that, you'll find that it's eerily similar to the serpent's temptation of Eve in Genesis 3. She saw that the fruit was good for food, pleasant to the eyes, a tree to be desired to make one wise. And so she succumbed to the temptation. It seemed right, looked good, couldn't hurt all that badly. Satan said, "You're not going to die." A lot of things sound, or maybe look like they might be right, but the devil is a master of lies. And of course, many things that come by way of, I believe it's Paul who said in 2 Corinthians, messengers of light. Seems like it's light, but it's not. We can't afford to forget that. And because if we forget that, then we're vulnerable. We're vulnerable. And if we don't forget that, then I think we're poised to be able to do things for the world that they need in ways in which they need it. And as we sing this invitation song, the invitation is always open to each and every one of us to make certain that we are right with God. And if you need to be right with Him, then the time is now as we sing.
I am resolved long to linger by the world's delights, things that are higher, things that are nobler, these have allured my sight. I will hasten to Him, hasten so glad and free. Jesus, greatest, highest, I will come to Thee. I am resolved to enter the kingdom, leaving the paths of sin. Friends may oppose me, foes may beset me, still will I enter in. I will hasten to Him, hasten so glad and free, free. Jesus, greatest, highest, I will come to Thee. The song before our closing prayer is number 490, 490.